Welcome to Forum360. This is Leslie Ungar, your host today. Thank you for joining us for our global outlook with a local view. It is hard to believe that 4 years ago, I welcomed our guest to what I then referred to as the Wild, Wild West. That is what I called the presidential primary season in 2016. I thought that was wild. Back then, we thought that was wild. And we had a guide to help us navigate through that crazy primary season that began with the ride down the elevator and ended with email server. He did such a good job as a guide that we invited him to guide us through the impeachment process and at least the first primaries. Dr. David Cohen from the Bliss Institute will try to explain impeachment and the primaries of 2020. Predictions? You might as well get a Ouija board. Welcome back to Forum360, Dr. Cohen. I'm looking to you as my guide.
Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. Okay, impeachment. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us first, how does, if it does at all, impeachment differ from a criminal trial? When you hear people, try to compare the two and say, well, in a criminal trial, this happens. Yeah. Is impeachment different from a criminal trial?
Well, the first part of the impeachment process is a little bit like a criminal trial in that the House is looking at the evidence and they vote, and then they vote on impeachment, and if it passes the House, that's the equivalent, I think, of a criminal indictment. It comes over to the Senate, where it's true there is a trial. The Constitution talks about a trial being held. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court will preside, but he or she is just presiding. They're not actually acting as judge in that case. The senators are essentially both judge and jury in this case. There are some pretty arcane rules. I think the viewers are going to see some, very kind of old-fashioned, out-of-date language when they convene this process in January.
Okay, so wait, that begs the question.
Yes.
Will we see it? It hasn't been, in whatever words yours are, it hasn't been given to the Senate.
Yes.
So maybe we should start there. Is it going to be given to the Senate?
It will. I don't think Speaker Pelosi is going to hold on to those articles of impeachment and not send them over. I think there would be too much political capital that she would burn if she did that, because it would make her look overly political. Like the House process was simply for show. So the articles will eventually make their way to the Senate. Whether it's in a week from now, and this is just after the first of the year, or whether it's 3 weeks from now, only time will tell. But it eventually will make its way to the Senate.
Does she have any leverage?
It's hard to say, because I don't think people understand how uncommon it is, first of all, for a president to be impeached and for there to be a trial held on that impeachment. President Trump is only the third American president in history to have been impeached. So we don't have a whole lot of precedent to look at in the past. And so I think, does she have leverage? It's unclear. Remember, the House is controlled by the Democratic Party. The Senate is controlled by the Republican Party. Mitch McConnell has stated publicly that it doesn't matter what Nancy Pelosi does. And in fact, he stated publicly that he'd prefer that she not even send over the articles, because he really does not want to have a trial. He's also stated publicly that during this trial, he will be coordinating with the White House, which is really an unprecedented thing to say, because even in years past, senators and the Senate leadership has gone out of their way to make clear that this process should be above politics and above partisanship. And by McConnell saying that he's going to coordinate with the White House, he's basically said this is going to be completely partisan.
What does the Constitution say about impeachment? Can you help us?
It says very little about impeachment. It says that the House of Representatives, will have the sole ability to look at impeachment. If it goes through the process and votes out articles of impeachment, the president is impeached. There is no appeal that the president can have. President Trump forever through the ages will be known as a president that's been impeached. There's nothing he can do that to expunge his record. And then the Constitution says once that happens, articles will be filed with the Senate, and that the Senate is to hold a trial. It does not give many details on what that trial is supposed to look like. And so it's really up to the Senate to determine what the rules are on this.
Can you help us understand abuse of power and obstruction of Congress?
Sure. Let's start with the second one. Obstruction of Congress, which is the second article that was that President Trump was impeached on, is basically an acknowledgement that the president failed to cooperate and provide testimony and provide witnesses to the House.
And why is that an impeachable crime?
Because the president is not above the law. The presidential branch is a branch that needs to be subject to congressional oversight. Because Congress does have the power of oversight. The courts have recognized this. The Constitution recognizes it. It's built into our separation of powers and checks and balances. And by the president not cooperating at all in any aspect with the House impeachment inquiry, the House determined that he was essentially in contempt of the Congress. And it's a very serious charge, because one of Congress's most important responsibilities, besides writing and passing legislation, is to have the ability to have oversight over the other branches and over, state and local government and industry and all that. That Congress's ability to investigate is extremely important.
So I grew up hearing 3 equal branches of government, which seem like kind of empty words until they get tested. But for people that say, well, but he's the president, what does 3 equal branches actually mean?
It means that no one branch is more powerful than the other. They all have certain qualities that give them power, and they all have an ability to check the power of the other branches. And that is one of the things that makes us unique in terms of our form of government, in that, and it is also a change from the system that we broke away from in England.
Where there wasn't oversight over the king.
Right, and there was, exactly, and there were not equal branches. So I think it's very important for Congress to assert its powers, especially in times like this. One of the arguments that the president made, and one of the legal arguments that the president and his team made, was that he had absolute immunity, not just executive privilege, which presidents from George Washington have claimed over certain issues that may have a negative impact on national security if they were to become public. President Trump and his team have asserted that he has absolute immunity, which means that he and the people that work for him are absolutely immune from any kind of judicial proceeding. And that nothing that they do in terms of conducting their business should be open to congressional scrutiny. It's an absurd argument, and it's being challenged in the courts, and we should know, in a matter of months whether or not this absurd argument is actually going to stand. The Supreme Court will rule one way or the other. I think most legal scholars are betting that they're going to rule against the White House, but we'll see.
Would you, with the Senate being Republican, would you have advised at all for a censure rather than impeachment?
Censure is, it's easier politically. It's just a simple majority vote. The problem is there are no teeth in it. It has no ramifications other than publicly slapping the president on the wrist. I think, personally, the House did exactly the right thing. I think that, in fact, I don't believe the House went far enough. They only filed 2 articles of impeachment on abuse of power and contempt of Congress. I think the Trump record shows so many more abuses and violations of the law, from emoluments to paying off of adult film stars, which violated campaign finance laws. There are, self-dealing with his properties. There's a slew of things that the House could have impeached him on, and they chose to take a very narrow strategy and focus simply on what happened in the Ukraine scandal. I think it was a mistake, tactically, because I think they should have gotten all this stuff on the record and voted on it. That said, I think absolutely the House should have gone with impeachment, because impeachment's a very serious thing. Again, he will be known forever as only the third president in American history to be impeached. That's a serious thing. He will wear the scarlet eye of history.
People might understand that. They might understand abuse of power. They might understand obstruction of Congress, but quid pro quo. Quid pro quo.
Yes.
Can you help us understand that? Why is that a problem in the Constitution?
Well, and quid pro quo is a very problematic term because it's Latin. I don't speak Latin. I'm sure you don't speak Latin. Most people don't understand Latin. But essentially means doing something in return for something. And now, let me just say, quid pro quos on the world stage, they happen all the time, right? That's, foreign policy. One country does something for one, in exchange, this country will do something for them. The difference is, in this particular case, the quid pro quo that President Trump was trying to get the Ukrainians, or the quid pro quo that was placed on the Ukrainians, was for the Ukrainians to investigate a political opponent in exchange for then the United States giving military aid to Ukraine to help them in their war with Russia. The problem is the quid pro quo surrounded a situation that would have helped the president personally. Not helped the country, not helped the United States, not helped our national security interests, but would have helped him personally in his 2020 campaign against what may be one of his political opponents. And so a quid pro quo in order to help the president personally, that's very problematic and absolutely impeachable. It's unethical. In my opinion, not only is it impeachable, but it's something for sure that a president should be removed from office for.
Now, as you said, that Speaker Pelosi will hand over the articles of impeachment to the Senate, and we will see a Senate impeachment hearing. Can you give us 2 or 3 things that people should look for? They tune in and watch an impeachment hearing. Yeah,
the one thing to look for is, will the Democrats be successful in getting 3 or 4 Republicans to come to their side in order to get 51 votes, for example, to bring in witnesses. Just this morning, former National Security Advisor John Bolton said that if he were subpoenaed, he would be willing to testify at a Senate trial. That's huge news, because John Bolton was at the center of so many of these things having to do with the Ukraine policy. So can the Democrats get somebody like a Republican senator like Lisa Murkowski from Alaska? Can they get somebody like Susan Collins from Maine? Can they get Mitt Romney from Utah? Can they get a handful of these Republicans to come over and vote with them so that they can force an actual trial with actual witnesses, just like happened in the President Clinton case, where they had witnesses that testified? So I think that's one thing very much to look for. Another thing is, will the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, move to end the Senate trial very quickly, which he potentially can do? Will he have a vote right up front to dismiss it, saying that there's not enough evidence? It's possible.
And what would it require? How many votes would it require for that?
That would require, I believe that would require, oh boy, you've put me on the spot here. I believe that would require a majority vote. I would have to look at the Senate rules that are in place from 1999. but I believe that would require a majority vote. I don't, I'm not 100% sure about that. So we need to look at, is he going to move to very quickly adjourn the trial? Because I think if he had it his way, he'd be able to do that if he could know that he wasn't going to get a lot of political blowback. So those are two things really to look for in this process. One crazy idea is when the House managers, are named and, they put their charges out, and then the Senate asks, President Trump to come and testify, or somebody in his place. Will the president actually come? Now, the president likes a good reality show, so I'm not 100% sure that he would say no.
We have been talking about the impeachment proceedings that are in our future. Also in our future are the primaries. Dr. David Cohen of the Bliss Institute is going to take us on a 30,000-foot journey through the upcoming primaries. First, I have to ask you, why did so many candidates think it was their time to run?
Well, I think, and it is very uncommon when you have an incumbent president that so many people in the opposition party want to run. And that's one of the reasons why so many Democrats jumped into the race is because, number one, Donald Trump is very vulnerable. In his approval rating, he has never reached 50% in approval. He's the only president since polling was invented to not have reached 50% in their first 3 years in approval. And in order to secure re-election, you really have to be at 50% or above. In fact, no president has won re-election without being at 50% or above. So vulnerability of the president. I think also the 2016 election showed a lot of people in the political system that, heck, if Donald Trump can win the presidency, anybody can win, literally. And that's why you have a businessman like Tom Steyer and Andrew Yang jumping into the race. Because they don't have any political experience, but they're like, hey, if Donald Trump can win, I'm wealthier than he is, why not? So I think that, and you have a lot of people, from the House of Representatives that jumped in.
Yeah, there's so many statistics to show that congresspeople make it to president, right?
The irony is you've had so many members of Congress running this year and some wealthy business people, but you've had very few governors. And usually governor is the stepping stone to the White House.
But the governors that were there got nothing. Even the senators basically haven't, a Cory Booker, it seems like in another year would have.
Cory Booker's been the biggest surprise for me, that he just has not gotten the traction that I think he's a very solid candidate. Extremely articulate, knowledgeable, experienced, former mayor. And he checks all the boxes, and yet, but the problem is there are so many other people that have gotten so much more press, and it's just, and the field's so big, it's just, if you're not in that first tier, it's hard.
So how, in a few sentences, how do you explain Mayor Pete?
Mayor Pete is first of all, extremely articulate guy. He knows his stuff. He is.
But to make it to really the top tier.
Great debater. I think what it was is he got this momentum early on. I think he had a CNN appearance, a town hall, and he caught fire. And he has really kept up with that momentum. He's done a very good job fundraising. I think his campaign has done a great job at just positioning him as really the Biden alternative. Mayor Pete started out way on the left part of the political spectrum when this first started, and then he realized his lane was more near where Joe Biden is. And as Joe Biden has shown that he's weaker than some people predicted, I think Buttigieg has really taken advantage of that.
Iowa and New Hampshire are our first two primary states. They're not demographically representative of
No.
the rest of the country.
They aren't.
So how is that going to affect the early voting?
I mean, let's just say right now, Iowa and New Hampshire have no business being the first two primary states. It drives me crazy every
they
election
are.
cycle, and they are, and they're going to be there for the foreseeable future. But really, if we want to fix our political system, you know, a state like Ohio, or a state like Michigan, or a state like Florida should be, you know, the first or second state. It's crazy that you have Iowa and New Hampshire up there. Iowa is extremely important, you know, and it's particularly vexing because it's a caucus. And
So explain to us the difference between a caucus and a popular vote.
well, a caucus and a primary, essentially, the difference is a primary is what happens here in Ohio. It's where you go into a voting booth
we
and you have a
vote,
secret ballot
right?
and you vote and that's it. It takes, you know, 5 minutes, especially in a primary to complete that process. In a caucus, especially the way the Iowa caucus works, you actually have to show up in person. You have to spend hours. You know, and the caucus could take place maybe in a school gymnasium, maybe in a church, maybe in somebody's dining room with 25 other people or 15 other people, depending upon where you live. And you have to literally spend hours talking and haggling, and the vote is in public. It's not a secret ballot. And, you know, it could be a show of hands. It could be you go over into this corner. If you support this candidate, you go over into this corner. It's a crazy process. It's kind of cool. You know, and on a local level, it's kind of the way politics should be. It's very transparent. But this is picking a president. And so the problem with the Iowa caucus and a lot of these primary elections is that only the most ideologically driven people are the ones that are going to take part in these things, which means the people that maybe don't spend as much time thinking about politics, maybe the people that are more in the middle of the political spectrum, normal people, right? People that have childcare issues, for example, that are working and they can't spend hours doing this. You know, they're not going to be taking part. And so you're in what Iowa, a place like Iowa does, and what the primaries do in general is it rewards the most ideologically driven candidates, or the ones that are sitting out on the extremes of the political spectrum. And then you end up with ideological candidates, and then when you get to the general election, you know, you may have people that aren't closer to where the general electorate is.
So in what may be my last question, the Bloomberg strategy, sit out the first four, no clear winner, and then everything kind of like starts all over again.
Yeah.
I've heard a couple people say, I'm considering Bloomberg.
Yeah.
I'm open to Bloomberg. So where does that leave Bloomberg a month or two from now?
Well, you know, the Bloomberg strategy only works if you're somebody like Michael Bloomberg and you've got, you know, billions of dollars.
But that's
right?
it, right?
So, and in the last month, I've not seen any candidate come close to the number of television ads that Bloomberg has run. For a typical person getting in that late to the race, they would have absolutely no shot.
Like Deval Patrick.
Right, like Deval Patrick, right, exactly.
They want to know, what was he thinking?
Yes, or the governor of Montana, who got in maybe a month after everybody else. He just never was able to get any kind of traction because it's starting earlier and earlier. But, you know, with Michael Bloomberg, when you've got that kind of money to spend on media, it almost doesn't matter.
So what's that going to mean for April, May, June? What is that going to mean?
Heck if I know. I have absolutely no idea. You know, we'll just have to. I think your viewers should watch Iowa. Iowa's the most important because if you don't have a top 4 or 5 finish in Iowa, and if you have finished a lot lower than expectations, you're done. You know, your money dries up, your media attention dries up.
If I gave you $1 million,
yes,
what would you tell me the ticket was going to be in fall of 2020?
$1 million?
$1 million.
Oh my gosh!
Would you leave it on the? Would you leave $1 million on the table?
You know, it's almost impossible to predict.
You need that Ouija board.
I think the thing is, in 2004, John Kerry, nobody was picking him to even finish in the top 5. He ended up winning the Iowa caucus, and then he ran the table pretty much. So I would say, I would caution people, you're going to see on television the top 3, top 4 mentioned all the time, Biden, Sanders, Warren, Buttigieg. Do not discount somebody like Amy Klobuchar. Do not discount somebody like Cory Booker, because if they can have a breakthrough performance and end up in the top 3, and they can, the whole race can turn on its head. Amy Klobuchar is my dark horse because I think she plays really well in a state like Iowa. She's from Minnesota, it's a neighboring state. Her numbers, if you look at them, they keep tracking upward. And I think she's going to be the one that is viewed as kind of the Biden and Buttigieg alternative.
For president?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yes or no, this is not a yes or no question, but a yes or no answer. Will the Electoral College trump the popular vote in 2020?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I hope not.
Our democratic process has many moving parts and many voting contingencies. Our guest today is an expert in presidential elections and all of those moving parts. We've heard terms throughout this process, and our guest has helped us understand them. Abuse of power, articles of impeachment. We always say it's important to vote. This year, it's important to stay engaged. Thank you for watching Forum 360 with Dr. David Cohen. I'm your host today.
Forum 360 is brought to you by John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, the Akron Community Foundation, Hudson Community Television, the Rubber City Radio Group, Shaw Jewish Community Center of Akron, Blue Green, Electric Impulse Communications, and Forum 360 supporters.